low-key scientific meeting to discuss an important topic of wide interest has now become an event that will be watched around the world. The establishment and the promotion of global warming decreed in November that this meeting would not occur because we three senior scientists did not meet their standards. That was a compliment. Thank you very much. Cancellation of meetings has become a standard tactic of warmers who not only find themselves pressed to explain a cooling climate when their computer codes repeatedly predict a warming one, but also completely unable to present any observed climate signature from the gradually increasing carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. Instead of admitting this, warmers promote carbon dioxide as an all-purpose explanation. A Greenpeace activist explained it so succinctly. Global warming can mean colder, it can mean wetter, it can mean drier. That's what we're talking about. You might think that warmers would disavow such nonsense, but they do not. There was even an article in Physics Today recently entitled "Global Warming Could Cause Colder Winters," and it was written by a PhD meteorologist, I'm sorry. Including virtually all physicians believe that peptic ulcers were caused by stress. Today, thanks to the work of two dedicated Australian researchers, we know for sure that a bacterium is involved. When Barry Marshall and Robin Warren were awarded the Nobel Prize in Medicine in 2005, the Nobel Committee noted the battle they had waged against the bad behavior of their colleagues who vigorously defended what the presenter called prevailing dogmas. In climate science, we have a similar situation amplified many times, not only by those in authority at institutions like the National Academy of Sciences, but by those ordinary scientists defending their research grants, by university administrators eager to stay on the vast federal gravy train, by politicians who have built their reputations and agendas around an absolute correctness of anthropogenic global warming, by a host of crony capitalists who've been lured into supporting cures for our imagined climate ills by a vast array of subsidies, and by a large number of ordinary citizens who are easily dazzled by those in authority because they lack education in science and because they see this as a new secular religion of environmentalism. Somewhere in the middle is our large and powerful institution, the Oregon Museum of Science and Industry. All it took to send them into a panic were a few phone calls from prominent professors at Oregon universities to remind them that we three musketeers might present heretical thoughts on global warming that might challenge their majority view. What sort of catastrophe are warmers promoting? Are we to be burning in hell by the end of the century as if condemned to the netherworld in Dante's Inferno? Or are they just worried about milder winter with less valley snow? Are they worried about a return of another Columbus Day storm or another Hurricane Katrina, the melting of the Greenland ice cap and the Arctic sea ice, or just the remaining glaciers on Mount Hood? Or are they worried that you might come to your senses and no longer support their insatiable appetite for research grants? The answer, of course, is all of these and anything else that they think is scary. For them, it's Halloween all year long. This topic has become a catch-all for hysteria, largely because we have let it become so, not because there is really very much to worry about. Now let's turn to the science, where we need to be very clear as to what the scientific topic is tonight. We're addressing the supposition that human emissions of carbon dioxide are warming the Earth's climate in a significant way. This is the so-called global warming. The argument against global warming is so extraordinarily simple and so powerful that we often forget to state it. There is no satisfactory logic and evidence linking human emissions of carbon dioxide to a significant warming of our climate. None. Let me say that again, none. There's plenty of evidence that our climate is changing and that it always has and always will change. Climate simulations that we see a lot of are not proof of anything any more than the wonderful simulations in Star Wars are accurate predictions of what life will be like in the future. They are just exercises in imaginary theories. After spending an incredible $100 billion looking for that evidence, it would be prudent to assume that the actual carbon dioxide effect is small and divert our taxpayer money to more pressing priorities. As an example of how good science really works, consider the efforts of Danish physicist Henrik Svensmark to solve the cloud mystery. His hypothesis is that the variable flux of galactic cosmic rays hitting the upper atmosphere causes a variable cloud cover. Extremely energetic cosmic rays cause water vapor to condense in the saturated air. Although each cosmic ray, typically a single proton that has come across the galaxy, leaves only a tiny wake of water droplets, the cumulative effect of many cosmic rays and their shower of secondary particles result in clouds that change the albedo or reflectivity of the Earth and hence its temperature. While this is an interesting and plausible theory, it could have exactly the same problem as the man-made carbon dioxide theory, a minor net effect on our climate. But unlike carbon dioxide, this climate driver has not been studied in significant detail so far. One reason I bring this up is that many years ago, I worked on the explanation for the varying cosmic ray flux of galactic cosmic rays. The theory goes like, Jupiter is the largest planet in the solar system, weighing in at more than twice as much as all the other planets combined. The Earth would easily fit in the famous red spot you see. In fact, about 7 Earths would fit in the red spot. The red spot is a giant hurricane of sorts that has lasted for at least 4 centuries. The banding of Jupiter's clouds is an indication that different latitudes rotate at different angular speeds, something not possible if the planet were solid. I remember one time I got after the Oregonian for saying that the surface of Jupiter is a very scary place. What's scary is it has no surface. Jupiter's climate, there's little doubt that it has a major influence over millennia and perhaps even over centuries. The easiest way to understand the importance of Jupiter is to look at temperature reconstructions from the ice core proxies. This sequence of charts places the global temperature increase over the last 2 centuries in perspective and helps us to understand what the future holds for planet Earth. Needless to say, these charts suggest a future that is far different from what alarmists claim. Incidentally, this is NOAA data. This is government data out of Greenland here. This first chart shows that our world did indeed begin to warm up from the Little Ice Age in about 1830. Extending the chart back to 800 AD shows the medieval warm period. And although ice core data does not cover the 20th century, we show with an arrow where the peak of the modern warm period will likely fall when the ice consolidates in a number of decades. It will be lower than the medieval peak. We know that for a number of reasons. Going back still further, we see a succession of warm periods spaced at roughly 1,200-year intervals, each less warm than the one that preceded it. During the Roman warm period, the great Carthaginian general Hannibal was able to march war elephants across the Alps to attack the Romans. Such a feat is not possible in our latest warm period because of the year-round snow in the mountain passes. Going back 11,000 years through the entire history of this interglacial period known as the Holocene climate optimum, the present climate change is utterly negligible. Note that human civilization developed during this warm period. We tend to like warm periods rather than cold periods. Going back 13,000 years, we see a much different era. What is that much colder period? It's an ice age, which lasted about 90,000 years. Note that ice ages have much more dramatic temperature swings than the benign interglacials. Our recent temperature swing is utterly negligible in this context. Note also that the temperature during the Holocene trended downward as we progress through the Milankovitch cycle that causes the Earth's closest approach to the sun to move from July to where it is now. About 90,000 years, followed by an interglacial lasting about 10,000 years, were explained by the Serbian physicist Milutin Milankovitch. Question: what causes the small variations in the Earth's orbit about the sun? That's right, the huge planet Jupiter. And tidal forces caused by the sun and the moon change the Earth's orbit just enough to bring about dramatic climate variations. Before I hear objections from OMSI supporters, let me point out that my fellow astrophysicist James Hansen and I agree about Milankovitch cycles, as do most other scientists. That does not assure that this explanation will never be challenged, but it does indicate that it has broad support across the spectrum. From the standpoint of climate alarmists, the critical issue is none other than a catastrophe of great proportions, ultimately involving the survival of man and of the planet. This is complete nonsense. What we find in contrast is a profound ignorance of science, even how science works. In one study, half the graduates of Harvard University could not correctly say why the seasons change. This is not a matter of memorization, but a matter of basic curiosity about a fundamental scientific process important to everyone. Should be of interest to everyone, too. For the Oregonian editorial board, that I deal with occasionally, and physicist Richard Mueller, the central issue was the warming over the 20th century. But that's a bogus issue also, because most scientists agree that this warming of about 0.8 of 1 degree is about 0.8 of 1 degree centigrade. Similarly, there is no dispute that carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, which is much less important than the main greenhouse and climate gas, water vapor. It may also surprise you to know that there is a little dispute as to the warming possible from a doubling of the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. The dispute arises when we consider consequences or feedbacks of this warming. Alarmists point to a strong positive water vapor feedback, while skeptics maintain that our climate system is inherently stable against such perturbations because of negative feedbacks. Chuck Weiss will address this in a good deal more detail than I am here. Most scientists who are aware of the global temperature data agree that we saw an increase after the Great Pacific Climate Shift of 1977. Steve was mentioning that you'll have Mantua here to talk about the PBL. But that, since 1977, was moderated by several huge volcanic eruptions until they ceased in the late 1990s. Thereafter, the global temperature has fluctuated with essentially no trend. When climate alarmists cannot talk about the logic and the data, they often try to question our scientific credentials or imply that we're in the employ of the oil companies. These are bogus issues. My thesis tonight is simple. Virtually all of what climate alarmists put forth as science is not. Some is half correct, some is incorrect, and too much is just plain nonsense. Temperature measurements. Well, these come from the microwave sounding units on NASA satellites and show amazing detail that is easily correlated with significant climate events like El Niños, La Niñas, and volcanic eruptions. In contrast to the surface data used by warmers that covers mostly land areas, the NASA satellite data covers a large portion of the entire globe. It is amazing that the global temperature is only about 1/10 degree centigrade above the 30-year average as of the end of last year, and has been falling because of La Nina conditions in the eastern Pacific. The preliminary data I've seen this month suggests another precipitous drop to below the 30-year average. In any case, we're right in there, very close to average. Why do most warmers insist on using inferior measurements to compile global temperature? Here is one reason. Urban areas are known to be warmer than the surrounding countryside because of all the concrete and steel and because of limited vegetation. This study shows that the temperature has indeed been rising sharply in the most heavily populated or heavily urbanized counties in California, but hardly at all in rural counties. Hence, any inclusion of temperature data from areas that have seen rapid development will be biased toward climatological network, has enormous biases toward higher temperatures because some sensors have been located too close to heat-producing or trapping structures. Those are pictures from Anthony Watts that are, show some of the problems. These known problems have become a reason for processing raw temperature data to supposedly address the problems. But unfortunately, it's been another exercise to turn cooling into warming as the records for this California. Everything started to come apart in the 20th century due to man's burning of fossil fuels. The central piece of evidence presented is Michael Mann's hockey stick graph. This graph has had an amazing existence, rising from the ashes each time someone points out a fatal flaw. Why? Because the UN IPCC desperately needs this graph and feels that it can withstand all criticism. The Wegman report to the National Academy of Sciences did not accuse Mann of fraud, but pointed out that his results were not supportable because of serious analytical errors. The East Anglia emails revealed that Michael Mann had used what was termed Michael's nature trick of removing tree ring data that did not support continued warming in the mid-20th century and substituting conventional thermometer records that did. The mismatched data should have told Mann that his data were not reliable, but instead they provided him exactly the result he wanted and worldwide acclaim. That has become an all too consistent pattern with those proving global warming. Here is the corrected version of the infamous hockey stick that eliminates Mike's nature trick and correctly shows the medieval warm period. Mann was intent on hiding the medieval warm period to bolster his claim that we are warmer today than at any time in the past 1,000 years. That is simply not true. Another example of bad science, or other examples are closer to home. Professor Phil Mote, now at Oregon State University, but then at the University of Washington, shows his signature contribution to the global warming debate and alleged shrinking of the low elevation northwest snowpack. Indeed, the data support his contention from the high reached in the early 1950s to the low in the 1990s. But what about before 1950 and after 1977? Well, he did not think it was relevant to report the entire data set that shows cyclical behavior but no real trend. You will never see this table of the worldwide record high temperatures from alarmists because it shows that all records for the continents were set long ago. That may seem inconsistent with the fact that we are slightly warmer today than we were in the early 20th century, but it may have to do with less effective mixing of cold Arctic air with warm tropical air when the sun is less active. The sun was generally less active in the early 20th century and also recently.